afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Washington Passport Network this afternoon on our webinar on mental health first aid, suicide, and self-harm. We do hope everyone is continuing to stay safe and healthy and warm during this time, and we appreciate you all taking the afternoon to join us to learn more about this very important topic. My name is Donna Quach, and I am the program manager for the Washington Passport Network here at the College Success Foundation. And then before we dive into the webinar, and I hand this over to the presenter, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items. So a reminder that all audiences are muted. This is to help reduce background noise. And we do encourage you to use the chat box and the Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to drop it in either one. And my colleague Essence Russ and I are monitoring those, and we'll hand over those questions to Sarah throughout the webinar this afternoon. And then another reminder is that this webinar is being recorded and can be found later this week on the Washington Passport Network website under the blog webpage. And then you can also find the recording on the WPN YouTube channel as well. All right, at this time, I am excited to introduce our presenter, Sarah Odell from Southwest Youth and Family Services. Sarah is a program development specialist and licensed marriage and family therapy associate at Southwest Youth and Family Services. And she has been working with kids and youth over 12 years in a variety of capacity here and abroad. Sarah was also one of the presenters at the Passport to Careers conference last fall and presented on an introduction to trauma-informed care. And we received really positive feedback for that presentation and topic. And this is why we wanted to invite Sarah back and bring her here for a deeper dive into mental health first aid, suicide, and self-harm. So I'm really excited to welcome Sarah back to the WPN. And thank you so much, Sarah, for lending your expertise on this important topic. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Donna. I am so excited to be with you all today. I have been presenting for quite a few years, and I really love the eye contact and the facial expression exchange. And so this format is a little bit different for me. So please do engage with the chat. And I know Donna and Essence will do a great job of moderating and curating that, because I really do want to hear from you. I have sat through many webinars myself since COVID hit, and I know that it can be droll. And I do not want this to be droll. I want you to leave with real actionable things that you can utilize in your work, because you wouldn't have carved out time in your day to be here if this wasn't something that was important to you. And with this topic particularly, we are talking about a life and death matter. And so I want this to be really helpful to you, and I want you to leave this feeling more empowered. Thank you to everybody who answered those initial questions when you registered for this. That's super helpful. And just to let you all know, I was able to kind of skim through some of the requests that were on there and have done my best to incorporate those in here. But if there's something that we don't touch on that you would like more information on, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. Donna and Essence can get you my contact information, and we can post it in the chat here as well. The other thing that I wanted to share is that out of all of you who did scale about where you feel in terms of confidence and feeling like you've been equipped or trained in responding to suicidal ideation and self-harm, the average answer was about a 5.5. So it sounds like, and there was quite a range. Some people said 0, some people said 10, and we landed right in the middle as a group. And so I will probably tend to err more towards the sharing a lot of information rather than assuming that everyone has it, again, because this is such an important topic. But it sounds like we at least have some exposure to it. And so we will dive right in. All right, so my goal today is for you to be able to have a plan when you leave here for what to do if you think that maybe one of the students or someone in your community that you're working with are experiencing some thoughts of self-harm. Maybe they've told you that they're engaging in self-harm, that they're contemplating suicide, or they're making comments that are really making you feel like, what's going on with this kid? What other resources do they need, and how do I respond? So that is what we are going to do. We're first going to talk over stats. We're going to talk over contributing factors because there definitely are some demographics, some populations that tend to have higher incidence of suicidal ideation and suicide. So we'll talk about that. I mentioned the confidence piece. I mentioned that I want you to have a personalized plan and next steps. And then my goal, and this is where we're going to utilize the chat. We thought about doing breakout rooms, but out of respect to your time, opted to use the chat instead, that you all would be sharing resources that are in your local community. So we will be working on that as well. Ooh, oh, sorry. Okay, the other thing that I want to mention, obviously we can't all see you. If you need to take breaks, pop out. We trust you all to do that. I think we've mostly got this all dialed in at this point in time. So we will start with the introduction to the topics, stats, terminology, and then we'll talk about self-harm interventions and suicidal ideation interventions as well. Okay, there we have it, there we go. So jumping right in, this is first going to be talking about some of the suicide facts. So I'm not going to read all of these over to you for the sake of time, but you can see the highlighted sections that are going to pop out. So first of all, men have a higher suicide rate, 3.7 times higher than female identifying people. These are going to be people who have completed suicide, who have died by suicide. So this is not necessarily, this isn't indicative of suicidal thoughts. So when I say suicidal ideation, that means any suicidal thoughts. That could range anywhere from, it just feels super hard to get up in the morning and I think it would be easier to not even be alive, which is not a very extreme suicidal ideation, all the way to a very active plan, which we'll talk about more later. But it's important to know that for this statistic, men have a higher rate of completing suicide, of death by suicide, compared to women. American Indian and Alaskan Native individuals have the highest suicide rates, followed by non-Hispanic white individuals. And then you can read the rest of that. In other populations, these rates tend to be much lower. Older adults have a really high suicide rate. And the highest suicide rate is among men aged 65 and older, followed by men 45 to 54. Women tend to have higher completed suicide rates between the ages of 45 and 54, and then 55 to 64. Suicide, those living in rural areas have much higher incidences of completed suicide, and LGBTQIA+ youth and adults also have higher incidences of death by suicide. These are a few graphs. These were all pulled from the National Institute for Mental Health. I have those citations at the end. You can go back and look at them a bit more. But this is looking at, here on the left, you're going to see age, and you're going to see rate across the bottom. And then female is in the turquoise color here on the left, and male is on the right. So you can see how that all distributes. And again, it corroborates what we talked about on the previous slide. This is the same slide, or a similar slide that is looking at race. American Indian, the top Pacific Islander, and again, these are all pulled from the National Institute of Mental Health. So as you are thinking through this, what I'd like you to be sort of thinking through as it applies to your own work is recognizing that certain populations are at higher risk for some of these. And so thinking about the populations you work with and thinking about, gosh, of the populations I work with, who might fit some of these demographics that I want to have my radar a little bit more up on when it comes to this topic about suicidal ideation. Self-harm is a different topic, so these statistics don't necessarily relate to self-harm, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but these do pertain to suicidal ideation and attempted suicide. These are rates by state. So the very darkest is where the highest rates per 100,000 people are. This data is from 2018. We'll talk a little bit about how the last year and all of the tumult from this past year has impacted these rates, but this is from 2018. So you can see in Washington, we are somewhere between 11.8 to 15.1 completed suicides per 100,000 people. Okay, this is pulled from a local organization out of UW, and they look at what they call the global burden of disease. And so this is comparing 2009 to 2019, and we're looking down here at self-harm, which would also include, as far as I'm aware, death by suicide. And so you can see that that decreased from 2009 to 2019 in terms of a ranking of which disease was most impactful to people's quality of life, and which caused the most deaths. Okay, and then this is also, I know we dove right into the deep end on a really hard topic, and I promise we'll have some time to process this a little bit later. But one of the other things that's really important to know is what the most common means are that people utilize when they are contemplating suicide and making a plan. And so knowing what means people utilize can also help you further down the line. So firearms are significantly utilized, and then suffocation, poisoning, which would include overdosing, taking a lot of medication, and then other. So we can kind of see through all of these charts that men, specifically Alaskan Natives and First Nations people, and those who are older men especially, who have access to a firearm, and white men who have access to a firearm, are going to be at significantly more risk statistically of completing suicide than someone who didn't have those identifying factors. That doesn't mean that we don't need to pay attention to all other populations. It's just knowing kind of what the trends have been over time. And these trends have been studied over several decades. Okay, so we're pivoting a little bit into suicidal spots. I wanted to ask if there were any questions that had come up in the chat yet.
We do have one question, Sarah. The question is, what are we talking about when we look at suicide by suffocation?
Yes, I don't know what the statistics are for that, or what particular methods that people don't utilize. Might be hanging, it might be carbon monoxide poisoning, like keeping a car in a garage and letting the engine run with the windows down, anything that is going to restrict airflow. But that is a great question. I can look into it more after this.
Thanks, Sarah. And then I do want to make an announcement that we fixed the disabled setting for the chat. So it should work now for everyone, and you can feel free to also use the chat.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, we're going to go back to that last slide. So this is a past year prevalence of suicidal thoughts among US adults in 2019. Now, I will say I don't know how they identified suicidal thoughts. And again, I mentioned a little bit earlier that people can have quite a range of suicidal thoughts. And in general, they tend to increase in severity over time if a person doesn't receive help or have some sort of change in their life that removes whatever was initiating this thought in the first place. So what we can see here is that overall, women tend to have more suicidal thoughts than men. About 5% of the female population in the United States among adults, which would be 18 and above, and 4.5% of adult males. Suicidal thoughts, and I believe this is a lot of you all as you're working with these young adults, suicidal thoughts are most prevalent between the ages of 18 and 25. And then as we look across here at race and ethnicity, we can see that actually people who identify as mixed race have the highest rate of suicidal thoughts, followed by Alaskan Native and American Indian, and followed by Hispanic and white. I think this is really an important distinction because oftentimes when we hear our clients express a suicidal thought, or that they'd be better off dead, or just be easier if they weren't here, we can immediately start to be concerned about an actual plan a plan for suicide. That's not always the case. The thought is much more common than having a plan and carrying out that plan. We do need to pay attention to the thoughts, but I find this really helpful to identify that there is a key distinction. And not everyone who has a suicidal thought is going to end up dying by suicide.
Sarah, we do have a question for you. Questions
Yeah.
from Ian. How can I identify someone that is having this type of problem? Are there signs or do they have to tell you about it?
That is a great question. I am realizing that I need something to write with. I'm going to jot down a couple of these questions to come to as we go on, get to a little bit later, because I think that will fit in nicely. But
Okay,
signs to keep an eye on. Thank you for that question. All right, so this shows a little bit about how many adults over the course of a year had serious thoughts of suicide compared to those who actually made a plan, compared to the smallest circle in the middle who went ahead and executed that plan with the hope of completing suicide. So 12 million adults had a serious thought, 3.5 made a plan, and 1.4 made an attempt. Now, this distinction here says 1.2 made a plan and attempted, while 217,000 made no plans and still carried out some form of suicide attempt. And so that is also an important distinction, that typically people are going to have a plan. It is very rare for someone to spontaneously utilize suicide. Okay. You might have noticed me stumbling over my words a little bit, and that is because the language around suicide is constantly under review to be as non-pathologizing as possible. So we want to recognize this as a mental illness, not as a choice that a person is making, not as something that is wrong with them. And also there can, especially in young adults and especially in teens, be sort of a glorifying sometimes if they do have a friend or hear of someone dying by suicide. And so we also don't want to glorify it, and we also don't want to make it a criminal behavior either. And so that's why suicide attempt or guilty of suicide would be language that we don't, sorry, not suicide attempt, but committed suicide is language that we're trying to move away from, because that also sounds like committed a crime, which suicide is not something that we are viewing through a criminal lens. So language that we do want to use is suicide plan, which I've mentioned several times today, suicidal ideation, which are those thoughts, death by suicide, and we can use suicide attempt as well. So pardon me as I stumble over those. I am still, like, I was reading about the most recent ones today. That's something to keep an eye on. But I think the guiding principles are that we do not, when we talk with people, when we talk with our communities, we don't want to make suicide sound like criminal behavior. We don't want to make suicide sound like, or suicidal ideation sound like a choice that someone is making because they make bad choices. And we also don't want to encourage any glorifying of it as a quote unquote easy way out. Might be language that some people would use. Okay, so we're going to deviate a little bit to talk about self-harm, and then we will circle back around to suicidal ideation and making a plan for that. Because actually, often people think of self-harm as being related to suicidal ideation and a plan for suicide, but they are not necessarily incredibly connected. Incidents of self-harm are much more frequent. And then we'll get back to that question on what signs to keep an eye out for. Now, with both self-harm and with suicidal ideation, gosh, see, this is where I do a Q&A if we were together, but because we're here, I'm going to keep monologuing. But what I would like for you to do right now is maybe take just 30 seconds and jot down, or just think in your mind, what are some signs that you would be keeping an eye out for, or would make you think, ooh, this person might not be okay. I wonder if they've thought about self-harm or are self-harming, are having suicidal ideation, what are some things that you might be keeping an eye out for? You can drop these things in the chat, or you can just jot them down on a note to yourself somewhere. I can't see the chat when I'm screen sharing, unfortunately. Donna, would you mind reading out if anybody drops any in?
Yes, for sure. There's a few. I can drop it in the chat for you too, Sarah. Actually,
yeah, if you just want to read them out, just like what are things that people would keep an eye out for? What are things that would be warning signals to you?
The question actually that we got in here, I think it might have been a typo and someone didn't mean to drop it in the Q&A, so I don't see anything as of right now.
Okay.
Someone did drop cutting into the chat, Sarah.
Okay, so cutting, yeah, cutting would be a type of self-harm. And definitely, for those who aren't aware of what cutting is, I'm gonna go very basic, maybe you all know, and I apologize if you do. Cutting is when people use a sharp object to cut some part on their body. It's often on inner arms or inner thighs or stomach, because people who are cutting are usually trying to conceal that behavior, and so they'll do it somewhere that it's not easily seen. People do not typically cut with the intent of causing a life-threatening injury. People tend to cut because they are looking either for some substantial release from emotion, they're looking to escape some strong emotion, and that distracts their mind from the emotional pain and redirects it to the physical pain, or they feel entirely numb and are looking for some sort of sensation, and physical pain brings that to them. So that is definitely a type of self-harm. It is probably one of the most common types of self-harm. Any other things that people have popped into the chat?
Yeah, someone asked if we can repeat the question.
Yes, the question is, what signs would you keep an eye out for, or what behaviors or comments might you hear from people that you're working with that would make you have a red flag go up and think, gosh, is this person maybe engaging in self-harm? Are they having some suicidal ideation? So someone had asked earlier in the chat, what are signs that we should keep an eye out for to know if we should ask more about this? And so I'm kind of putting that question back to the group for self-harm and for suicidal ideation. Like, what are the red flags that a kid is really not doing well, or that a young adult is really not doing well?
Yeah, there are 3 things that popped in. Increase of use of drugs or alcohol, isolation, and then students who do not want to show their skin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are all very, very accurate. So in general, whenever someone is increasing substance use, it usually is a self-medicating behavior. And so this isn't a substance use presentation, but anytime someone is utilizing any sort of outlet to experience pleasure, to escape reality, to kind of numb or self-soothe in some way, that can be an indication that they are not well. Definitely students not wanting to show skin for any reason would put a red flag up. Increased isolation, which we're all experiencing a lot of right now, can also be a contributing factor. I would also add that anyone who has experienced a significant loss or trauma, maybe it's a death of a loved one, maybe it is the loss or an illness, an injury, maybe it is unemployment, maybe it is experiencing a lot of housing instability or food instability or resource instability. And those things do not mean that someone will absolutely have thoughts or behaviors of self-harm or suicidal ideation. We just know that when people experience increased stressors, that can also result in increased feelings of hopelessness or despair, or feeling overwhelmed. I don't know, I'm gonna keep moving forward here. I don't know how many of you were on our presentation that we did on trauma-informed care, but one of the things we talked about, and maybe grab a piece of paper and a pen to write this down, is the A plus B plus C equals X model. And I think it's important for this one as well. And I'm sorry I don't have a slide for it, but it is basically a mathematical equation, the only one therapists use to talk about trauma impact. And so A represents the event that happened, whether it's an event in a short moment, like an acute trauma, or an event over a long period of time, like COVID closures, or police brutality, or unemployment, food instability. It could be anything. But A is the event. B is the individual's beliefs about that event. And C is that individual's access to resources. Those resources could be socioeconomic resources, they could be relational resources, they could be faith-based resources. They're anything that are going to be beneficial to that person. And all of those things added together equal the trauma impact. And so the beliefs one is also, we don't have much control over the events that happened, but we can have control over the belief and over the resources. And that's where we, as people who are working with these clients and communities and students directly, can help them to explore their beliefs and voice them and maybe adjust some of them. A belief of like, I'm never going to be able to do this is very different than this is really hard, but I can do it. And so, helping explore beliefs is one, and then also increasing resources. And we'll talk a lot about resources a little bit later on. But I think that's something to think about. So if you know that the students that you are working with have experienced some significant loss or hardship, then also looking at, well, what's their belief and attitude about that? And what resources do they have around them? And that will give you, so if a kid had a very difficult event, already had some pretty solid beliefs about themselves being worthless or never going to amount to anything, or I can't do this, or the system is just totally out to screw me over and I'm never going to get past it and no one wants to help me. And they have very few meaningful relationships and housing instability and food instability and all these things. That would be a kid that would be really high on the radar for self-harm or suicidal ideation, because their beliefs and their resources are not going to be very helpful to them in responding to this event. Do you have any questions? I just talked for a long time on one slide with 4 words.
We do have 2 questions. The first one is Native and Indigenous populations are also some of the most marginalized. So how do we offer help that is inclusive?
Can you give me the other questions too?
Yeah. The second question is, what is the major factor that can drive a refugee youth to suicide or self-harm? Do you have any ideas on how to prevent this?
Yeah, these are excellent questions. And as these questions reference these populations, and I'm saying this fully acknowledging that I am a white woman, so I am aware of my location, and that I'm a U.S. citizen. And in race, I'm aware of my location. There is very little research on these populations, unfortunately, because unfortunately, as you probably all know, the research follows the money, and the money tends to follow certain populations. With that said, how do we help those students that are in these marginalized? So first, I'll answer the first question, Native and Indigenous populations that are marginalized. Specifically with Native and Indigenous populations, and I can do some more research on this, or we can share them in the chat, because I actually suspect that within the 109 participants that are on this call, some of you know these resources better than I do, because I'm not aware of all the resources in all of Washington State. But that the Native and Indigenous populations often tend to have some of their own networks more internally. It also can be really helpful to utilize some of the framework from, and this is going to be true with any culture, with any population and community, is to utilize their framework of beliefs, of community, of how one is oriented to the world and meaning, as you are offering support and helping connect them to resources. So you might have one client come in and they really want to go see a doctor, they want a prescriber, they want medication. You might have another client come in and they really want to utilize a faith-based support resource. You might have another client come in and they actually don't want to use any professional resource. They want to use more of a relationship in their life that is meaningful to them, or they need to expand that relationship network. And so I don't feel like this is where the work really falls back on each one of you. And us is to know each of your kids and your students and clients really well, to know where they find their greatest sense of support from, and then know what resources are in the community to help them specifically. I feel like that was not a great answer, but it is my honest answer. And I promise to not tell you something that I don't know. In terms of refugee youth suicide and self-harm, I know that there have been several of those pretty recently in King County, specifically among that population, or suspected suicide specifically from drug overdosing. And if you work with that community, just know that you have definitely been on my mind and on my heart. And I do know there was there was going to be an event. I can look at it after this and send it on to Donna if it's still upcoming. I think it might have been on February 22nd. That was specifically for the Somali community to talk about mental health and suicide and self-harm prevention. So when we're working with those populations, again, it's kind of looking for where there's grassroots things happening. A lot of the mental health approach in the United States can come from a really white male perspective, because that's its origins, and we're working hard to change that. But oftentimes those things are not going to be as widely publicized. So I don't like the answers that I have to those questions, but those are the answers that I have. Do people have other resources that they know of for those specific populations? For Alaskan Native or Indigenous people, and then refugee youth? If so, could you drop those in the chat, please?
Then we do have a hand raised. Sylvia, did you have a question for us? Okay, feel free to unmute yourself if you do, or you can drop it in the chat or Q&A.
Okay. All right, we're going to keep moving forward because I want you to leave with a plan. So interventions for self-harm. We talked about this, what the function of self-harm is. We've talked a little bit about the function of suicide and the relationship between the two. Interventions for self-harm, and this is going to be similar to suicidal ideation, but part of it is going to be assessment. So determining how often the behavior is occurring, where on the body the behavior is occurring, and how it's helpful to the client. It's also, I think, in your role, as I understand many of you work with students, is to ask if the student would like some more resources or some more help towards that. If it seems like the client is putting themselves at physical harm, like needing to go to the hospital, then at that point, looking at looping in another support person from their community, or getting them connected with a professional therapist would be helpful. So now if you have clients who are absolutely opposed to meeting with a therapist, we can discuss that a little bit more later. But this is sort of a nuanced thing to treat, and going back to that beliefs and to the resources that someone has will be really important. So working with students on their beliefs and helping to increase their resources is going to be really important. That support is really what we're talking about, is those, especially the resources that you can give them, even just your time, relationships, letting them know that they're not alone, letting them know that this is something that a lot of people experience, and finding replacement behaviors can also be really helpful. So if kids are using self-harm, or young adults are using self-harm as a way to escape an emotion, can they also get that by taking like an ice cold shower, going for a run, doing a bunch of push-ups, or eating a bag of super spicy chips or something like that, that still gives the body a physical sensation but doesn't cause harm. Those can also be really helpful things. And helping them identify who their resources can be. Who can you call when you feel this way? What activity can you do that makes you feel good? Is there a lot of people find it super helpful to listen to music And so having them kind of identify that is important. And then checking in with them. You know, one thing that's really important is that we normalize that it's okay to have these conversations. And one of the things that's super hard when we are working with people is a lot of people feel really awkward bringing up suicidal ideation or self-harm. For the most part, you are not going to offend somebody if you ask. They're going to feel like they're cared for. They're going to feel like they're seen and that they have someone to talk to. And so just even asking, like, oh, do you ever do anything to hurt yourself? Oh, well, what do you do? And not having a big reaction yourself is going to be really important. Okay, so for suicidal ideation, so first of all, and this is where I'd like you to pull out a piece of paper and we're going to start making a plan. We want you to leave here with a plan and we have 21 minutes and we're going to do it. Is first of all, what are your personal boundaries and scope? So it's really important that you know what you feel confident and trained in as it comes to this topic and what you don't, as well as what your mental and emotional and life realities are, because you need to take those into consideration. So what I'd like you to do right now is just jot down a couple, like my personal boundaries, and these can be time related. Like my personal boundary is I don't work these hours, or I don't work these days, or I don't give out my personal cell phone number, or I don't transport clients, or I don't know what those are for you. I'm not saying those are what they should be. Those are just a few examples, but jot down what a few of your personal boundaries are, as well as, after you've jotted those down, what you would currently feel comfortable and trained in responding to. I would feel comfortable supporting a client who was self-harming. I would feel comfortable asking a client about self-harm. I would feel comfortable asking a client about suicidal ideation. I would feel comfortable supporting a client who had a suicide plan. Unless you are a trained mental health professional, once you get to the point that a client has a suicide plan, you definitely should refer out and get them connected to a therapist. That is not any reflection on you. It's just at that point, that person needs a little bit more mental health support, and you can absolutely still be a part of that plan and that under that resources category for that person. Under legal considerations, some of you are probably mandated reporters, some of you may not be. This gets a little bit tricky when it's adults, but we still do have a responsibility, many of us do, I know I do, to legally try and keep people safe. So if I think someone is a risk to themselves, even if they're an adult, then I'm going to try to connect in with someone else in their life who I know would probably be the best person for them, whether that's a family member or a friend or something like that, someone else to kind of help keep them company and be a little bit more present in their life than I am for the time that I am in a week. And I would also know that I can always call for a wellness check from first responders, or some counties have mobile teams that will go and check on someone, and they're not police. So Seattle has the crisis line and the mobile crisis care team. So this is another spot where I'm going to ask you all to drop in the chat if you know of other agencies that can respond and do like wellness checks or check-ins with people if you're really worried about their safety. So thinking about your legal considerations, and also think about if a kid or a young adult talks to you about having self-harming behavior, specifically if they're cutting on the inside of their arm. A lot of kids don't know that if they cut on the inside of their wrist too deeply, or where on their body they could cut, that actually could result in something very serious. And so we want to make sure kids are aware of that, but we also want to make sure that if the horrible thing happened and something did happen to one of these kids that we're working with, and it came back that we knew that there was some risk going on, legally just be thinking about what you would have done and what you would have documented and who you would have pulled in to show that you did everything within your means to keep that person safe. And so this is where going back to your agencies as well and finding out what your agency protocol is for something like this is important. And if your agency doesn't have one, really asking that be put into place. Okay. Severity assessment we're going to talk about in a minute. Immediate safety we'll talk about. We've talked about the use of existing resources, and we've talked a little bit about community emergency resources. But I hope you all have these 6 bullet points written down, because I want you to have this with you where you could pull it out, reference it, maybe it's notes on your phone or something like that when these conversations do come up. Donna, do we have any questions?
We do. 2 for you. The first one is, let's see, it sounds like, so this was going back to the previous slide, that you're focusing on individuals' existence, meaning, and purpose. What are your thoughts on existential phenomenology as a resource for therapy with these targeted groups? And then the second
person who asked that question, does existential phenomenology mean like a religion or a faith or spiritual belief? Can that person clarify what they mean by existential phenomenology while Donna reads the next question?
Yeah, the second question is, if a young adult informs us of their self-harm, is that an indicator they are seeking our help, or is it sometimes just to get it off of their mind?
That is a great question. If a youth is telling you that they're engaging in self-harm, it means they trust you. And that's amazing and well done. And at that point, I would start asking them how they feel about that behavior. Is it something that how do they find it helpful? And would they like help in finding something else to do? And asking them, how did it feel to tell me that? Who else have you told that to? That's where I would start with that youth. The other thing I really love to do when I work with all people, but especially youth and young adults, is emphasize that they are experts on themselves and their life, and that they really probably do know what it is they need. They need a place where they can articulate that a little bit more. And so if a kid is already informing you of self-harm, then they're opening the door to you to have that conversation. And I would definitely walk through that door. Did we get clarification on the existential phenomenology?
Not yet. Christopher, if you want to drop it in the chat, or I think you can also unmute yourself, you can do that too. We can move forwards there, and then if
okay. I'll circle back around to that question if I get a little more clarity.
Sounds good.
All right, we talked a little bit about your personal boundaries. If you didn't get any jotted down, here are a few more to jot down, because your well-being is absolutely critically important to your ability to help people experiencing self-harm or suicidal ideation. So I mentioned some time boundaries, physical boundaries as well, in terms of like phone numbers and driving around. Your mental boundaries might be, this is really hard, especially with COVID, but how are you transitioning when you're working with kids back into your life and your homes and your relationships and your other things to do? So especially if you're working with students who are disclosing self-harm or suicidal ideation, that will start to take it could start to take a pretty significant mental and emotional impact on you. And so it's really important that you have people that you can talk to about that without sharing any identifying information about the client, but where you can kind of process what that's like for you. And then also giving your brain a chance to kind of decompress and relax. So going for a walk, listening to music, really those things that maybe seem simple, and you might have a very different list than I would have, and that's great, but make your list for the things that are going to help you kind of decompress and be ready to go back in and continue to work with these clients who are experiencing these things. Some other things you might want to consider on legal considerations and agency protocol. Do you need to notify your supervisor? What documentation do you need to have in place? What organizations are in your area that you can call? What level of engagement are you going to have with the client? So if a client really is in high distress with suicidal ideation, has a pretty active plan, do you go to that client's house? I think some of you probably are in positions where you might, and others of you wouldn't. But knowing what that is and being able to communicate that clearly to the client and then fill in the gaps is really important. And do you have access to your client's emergency contacts? So, and especially with young adults, this can be kind of tricky. With younger kids, it's pretty easy to usually have some sort of guardian or caretaker's phone number. But with young adults, do you have the number of someone else that you could contact if you're concerned about this use? Would you know how to get a hold of them if they weren't picking up their phone? Okay, here are the severity assessment, and this is going to be important. I'm sorry we don't have more time. Risk factors, we talked about sort of the demographic risk factors. The other thing is family history. So if you know that someone has a history of someone in the family attempting or completing suicide, if you know that the client themselves have had a suicide attempt, or if someone in their community at school, in their friend network, in their cultural community have had a completed suicide recently, that's a risk factor. Protective factors are some of the things that we talked about. So beliefs and resources, right? So what are their spiritual beliefs? What do they believe? How do they believe a completed suicide would impact their family and friends? And what responsibilities do they have? So protective factors can be pets. They can be siblings. They can be a belief of God wouldn't want me to do this. They can be beliefs of I know I was made for a purpose. They don't even have to be spiritual beliefs. They could be other beliefs that have to do with their meaning and why it would be important for them to stay alive. So those are protective factors. Now, when you have an idea that someone might be considering suicide or have some suicide ideation, you want to ask directly. And this might feel incredibly awkward. And I'm going to put Donna on the spot and ask if she's willing to do a little role play with me.
Yes, I can try.
You're going to be great. You're going to be great. So I am going to give you an example of how I would ask someone if they had any thoughts of suicide. And you can just respond to me. Let's say that you do. Okay. So I'd like for you to have some thoughts of suicide, and I would like you to have some level of plan. And you get to decide right now on your own if you're like for sure going to go through with this, or if it's maybe not to that point. So I would say something like, hey, Donna, you've made a couple comments about like life just being super hard or it being easier if, you know, you didn't have to deal with all of this. And I just wanted to check in. Have you had any thoughts or ideas of suicide?
You know, I have, and I've been thinking a lot about, I do have some ideas and have bought some things, and I'm not sure if I want to go through with that at this time.
Okay, great. So actually in that situation, if a client told me that much, I would be like picking up the phone to call someone immediately, because they're telling me in that situation that they've thought about it, they have ideas, they bought some things, which means they now have access to means, and they're really thinking about it. So at that point, I would say like, we're on full alert. This person needs immediate support. This time, Donna, I want you to be a little bit harder for me to get that information from.
Okay.
Okay. So just like one word answers on those. Kind of same question. Donna, have you been having any thoughts of kind of self-harm or suicide?
Yes.
Okay. And have you thought about killing yourself?
Yes.
Okay. That can happen to a lot of people. Do you have an idea of how you would do that?
No.
Okay. So when you have those thoughts, what are those thoughts like?
Just dark, sad.
Yeah, a lot of people are feeling that right now. Awesome. Break. Thanks, Donna. So at that point, I would start asking that person if they wanted some more connection to resources. And if they said no, then I would probably say, like, tell me some more about what the dark or sad things are that are going on. Do you want to talk about this some more? Can I check in with you about this again? Can I check in with you again about some of those thoughts of suicide or self-harm? You know, will you let me know if those come up more? And is it okay if I check in with you again? So just being really direct, being really not alarmed or surprised, taking them seriously and letting them know that you continue to be there for them is super, super helpful. So some of what Donna and I demonstrated was determining risk level, passive versus active. So passive is that, like, I just kind of think it'd be easier to be not here anymore. Active is, I bought some things, I have a plan, I'm pretty sure I'm going to do it. Access to means is, I bought some things, access to firearm, so if somebody says, yeah, I think about it, I would ask like, oh, do you have a firearm in the home? Do you have access to a firearm? Do you have a friend or a family member who has a firearm? Because that's really important to know. And then document. So you do want to, again, check with your agency, check with what your job title requirements are, but wanting to be sure that if something happened and your client did die by suicide, that you would be able to explain why you did every single thing that you did along the way, who you looped in, what your client said that made you decide one way or the other, who you consulted with about this, and what your plan was along the way and how that was communicated to your supervisors or colleagues or emergency response or the client. Okay, we talked about this with level of intent. You can ask scaling questions. So like on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to pursue death by suicide? You could also ask, how often are you having these thoughts in the past 48 hours, in the past month, or are these the worst thoughts ever? So kind of giving a sense of that. You can also ask like, how lethal do you think that is? So you might have people say, oh, I'm just going to hold my breath for a really long time, but that's actually not super lethal. And so that can also be something that's important. But if they really believe it's lethal and they're going to go through with it, then knowing they really do have an intent to be done with life would be very important. Again, we talked about the plan effectiveness. So that's how lethal is the plan that they have in place, and then what access do they have. We've talked a lot about protective factors, so continue to keep those in mind. These are also your kind of cascading levels of risk and determining them, which we've also talked about. So low, moderate, or high. High is kind of that first that Donna demonstrated. She had a plan, she'd gone out to the store, she bought something, and she was really thinking about it. I didn't get a chance to ask her, well, why wouldn't you do that? Which is another valuable question that you can ask someone if they're talking about this is, well, why wouldn't you pursue suicide? Or why do you think it would be good if you decided to stick around? Can be very, very helpful. So what you want to do based on these levels of risk, right? If they're low risk, kind of in the second scenario Donna and I played out, then you want to make sure they have emergency numbers, resources, make sure you have their emergency number of an emergency contact, refer them to mental health support, and let them know the next time that you're going to contact them. So saying like, hey, I'll check in with you tomorrow at 2, or I'm going to talk to you next week at our appointment, and just kind of establishing that next connection time. Medium, you want to develop some sort of crisis plan. And so that's saying, hey, if this thought comes back, then you're going to do this. You're going to call this person, you're going to go for a walk or a run, you're going to listen to some music, kind of helping them come up with that list of like, if you start to feel bad, these are the things that are going to help you feel good. And these are the people you can reach out to for help. And again, refer them to mental health support and establish a next connection time. Now, someone who has a high risk, you are going to want to connect with emergency services unless a significant environmental change can occur immediately. That significant environmental change would be like, oh yeah, I can talk to the parent that they live with, and their parent's going to be totally on board with helping with this. They're going to restrict access that they have to anything in the home that could harm them, and they're going to get them connected to emergency services. And even if you do that option, I would still loop in with your supervisor and make sure you don't need to do anything else. Okay, do we have any questions?
Nope, we don't. And I know that you're keeping an eye on time too. Wanted to kind of pressed for time.
Yep, totally. Okay, crisis plan we've already talked about, and your supervisor and supporting people. Okay. We are not going to have time to finish all of this today because we had some great questions come in, but we can send this PowerPoint out afterwards. I think what I'd like to do at this point is ask if there are any final questions.
We did just get one from Carrie. Can you talk a little bit about breaking trust when you have to call crisis response?
Yeah. So if you have to, what I always do with my clients from the very first time that I meet them is I let them know, hey, what we talk about is confidential. unless I'm concerned about your safety. And then I'm going to loop someone in to keep everybody safe. And I'll always do my best to let you know if I need to do that. And so if you establish that from the very beginning, you could even establish that in the middle of your relationship with a client and say, hey, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but just so you know, this is what I do. Then if you do need to call crisis response, then you can come back and say, I'm so sorry that I needed to do that. Your safety is my #1 priority. And I've even worked with clients and said, hey, I think it might be time to make that call. And do you want to make it? And sometimes they do want to make it. And then I'm there empowering them to reach out for that help. Any other questions in our last 30 seconds?
Don't see any coming through.
Okay. All right. Well, you all are doing great work. We will send this PowerPoint out, and I will also send out my contact information as well as a link where people can request counseling services if they would like those. And I just want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day today, and I hope you are well.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Everyone, on behalf of Washington Passport Network, we definitely want to thank you for presenting on this really important and very timely topic right now. And thank you to everyone for attending this webinar. We will follow up the slide deck that will be posted on the website, as well as access to the recording of this webinar. Thanks, everyone, and take care.